Good morning, everyone out there in YouTube land. My name is Jared, and this is my channel, Mazda B3K. In this episode, we are going to work on replacing the front shocks and the front CV axles on my wife's 2010 Ford Fusion with the 3-liter V6 engine. Without further ado, let's get started. Okay, very briefly, symptoms. For a while when you drive, every time you hit the brake and let go of the brake, there's a pop click. When you punch the gas, if you ease into it, it's fine, but if you punch it with any sort of vigor, you get a click thunk, which are kind of indicative of CV axles. And then in the last few weeks, now there's a vibration, a loud vibration that you start hearing above about 20 miles an hour. And it gets really obnoxious around 55. And I noticed that when you turn, I think it was when you turn left, it was much, much worse than when you turned right. In fact, it was so much so that if you made a right-hand turn, basically the vibration was gone, even at speed. But if you made a left, it was super, super loud and obnoxious. All those things kind of tell me that instead of it being a wheel bearing, which can also make loud vibration and growly, roary noises, that it's the CV axles. So that's what we're going after. And also for quite some time, this vehicle's had horrible clunk in the front, only when you're going over bumps. I think it's just a simple matter of the shocks are worn out. The previous owner, my brother, he put in Bilsteins and they did fit. They were for this vehicle, but just I think they're worn out. I live down a really bumpy dirt road, and my wife does drive with Spirit. And when you put those two together, you're going to wear your shocks out early. So anyway, I have the parts for those. I've gone ahead and done a little bit of pre-work. Vehicle is in the air. You're going to need to take a floor jack, get her up in the air, get her on jack stands, give her the old shimmy shake. Make sure that it's not going to fall on you. And once you've done that, we'll go ahead and get started. All right, it's a 19 millimeter for your lug nut. If you're still using a standard lug nut and you haven't gone custom, I strongly recommend that you have an impact driver for this job. We're going to be pulling a lot of bigger bolts in some weird spots. So if you can torque your way out of it, absolutely recommend it. And we'll set all this aside, and we'll set the tire aside because we got to get in there deep, real deep. You stuck? Yeah, we're stuck. How about that? Oh, we're not stuck anymore. All right. Moving on. If you've watched my brake job video on this vehicle, yeah, it's probably not holding too well. I got to replace the upper control arm on this one. It's got a ball joint with a blown out boot. But anyway, if you've watched my brake video, then you'll know what we're about to do is basically we got to do a brake job. We got to take the loaded part of the caliper out, which is where your pads are. I know it's a little bit out of frame there. There we go, right here. So we got to get this loose. So there's two 14s we're gonna have to take out, top and bottom. And I may wind up needing a hammer for these. Sorry about that. Now these guys like to spin, so you may have to put a tool right here, keep it from spinning. But we got to get the loaded caliper out of the way. We got to get the frame out of the way. Once we do that, we got to take the rotor retention screws out, take the rotor off, because basically we got to strip the knuckle apart. The knuckle, I mean, it's got a couple different names, but let me back you out so you can see. See this big guy here? It comes down into here. This is called the knuckle. And generally, it's where all your suspension stuff connects. It's where your steering stuff connects. It's where your brake stuff is. And on an old school vehicle, you'd have an inner and outer bearing here that you got to play with. But since this one's newer, it has one big bearing that's pressed into a hub. Anyway, we got to strip all these connections off so that we can swing the hub, the knuckle, whatever you want to call it, out of the way, which will allow us to pull the CV axle. That's the name of the game, and I'm just going to go through those steps. Now, if you haven't done brakes on these things before, they're super annoying. There's these spring clips that are supposed to go across. And the moment you take this caliper off, they're going to go patooey and try to fly off in the la la land. You do need them. They do serve a purpose. So just try not to lose them. And then we'll go through some steps on how to reload the caliper and everything where it's not so obnoxious as we put it back together. See, spring clips. You see how it's pushing it apart? Just gotta set those aside. Set your pads aside. And it looks like these pads did not come with a wear indicator. That's nice. They wearing evenly? Yeah, looks like it. I just did brakes on this vehicle not maybe 500 miles ago because they had dug into the rotor and it was not cool. All right, we've got, lean you forward so you can see it. We've got two of these. I think they're 15s, and that's to hold the frame in place because now we got to take the frame out. And same deal, grab a 15, get in there. You may need a hammer to help loosen things up, but you know, get that loose and then we'll focus on the rotor. All right, we have two bolts, or two screws really, that help to hold the rotor in position. They are of the Torx variety. They are T40s. And as you can see, oh yeah, I remember how I did this. The rotor is going to try to spin. So what I recommend you do here is, again, get some sort of power tool with a lot of torque and just bzz, you can zip it right out. If you have to use a regular ratchet, you're going to need to use probably like a pry bar, and you can run it off against the ground to keep this from moving, and then you can pop it loose. But I have power tools, so I'm going to use power tools. Another lovely thing to have, I have a pack of converters that let me go from 1/2 to 3/8, 3/8 to 1/4, and everything in between. They are amazing for situations like this. Just bear in mind, you may wind up causing torque problems where you might damage something because you went from one size to another, and now the new size can't handle the torque of what you're trying to do. As you can see, I was able to break those loose super easy. So we're going to get these out, and then we got to be careful because when we take the rotor off, the caliper that is sitting on top of the rotor is going to try to flippy flop somewhere, and we're going to have to kind of stick it somewhere because you don't want it to dangle. So worst comes to worst, you may have to get some blocks of wood to have something for it to sit on, but you don't want to stress your brake line. All right, now if you live up north, this might be stuck. Might be kind of rusted in. I don't. I live in the south. And worst I have to deal with is alligators and people eating bath salts and hurricanes and things like that. All right, that gets us here. So now you can actually see sometimes you'll hear it called an axle hub or a wheel hub or the knuckle, right? So we have a connection here, which I know you just see my hand there, but this is for your steering rack, your tie rod. And then there are connections for your lower control arm that we don't actually need to take out, fortunately. We have the connection for the bottom of the shock tower that we need to take out. We don't need to take out the upper, so we don't have to worry about the tie rod. I should probably bring you in to see this kind of stuff. I said tie rod, I meant to say sway link. This is your sway link. This is the bottom of the shock tower. Sometimes they call it the wishbone in this design. And you can see the CV axle goes through it. We're actually gonna have to sneak it in through the bottom of it whenever we take it out, put it in. Here's the tie rod. We're gonna have to pop loose. And we are gonna need to loosen up this upper control arm. This is the one, as I mentioned, it's got the bad boot. But we're gonna get all this loose, pop all this stuff out. And we're gonna have to take the bolt that runs through this. I don't know what this thing is, but there's a bolt that runs through here. We gotta get that out. But we do all that and take some little things off, like this is your anti-lock brake sensor. Oh wow, that got chewy. Still works though. I'll take it. Gotta take that out. A couple other things. You know, probably want to take this clip out for the brake line. That gives us more flexibility to stick the caliper somewhere. And we get all that off. And then we can actually try to pull the CV axle out, because literally it kind of seats in there at the transmission side, and you just kind of have to pop it out. Since it is right here in front of us, this is our tie rod, and it's a 19 millimeter. We're gonna go ahead and get that out of here. Stick that in the seat, just like that. Now, it is pressed, this ball joint is pressed in a bit, so there's a couple different ways we can go about this. You can leave the nut on here to make sure you don't damage something. You can get a mallet and tap from the top to hopefully knock it loose. You can take a hammer and beat on the actual tie rod, since it's a good piece of steel, and knock it loose that way. But two things you really need to not do. Don't do anything that would damage these threads, because then you need a new ball joint. And on this vehicle, that means just get a new tie rod. And the other thing is, don't take a pickle fork and try to pop it out that way. That's old school, and if you were putting in a new one, fine. But pickle forks, when you jam them in there like that, they tear the boot. So if you're wanting to reuse it, well, that's not very good. So just don't damage the ball joint. That's the big thing. All right, first we're gonna try to give this some encouragement with a mallet. That's not working very well, and I may have just damaged these threads. I just did what I told you not to do. We're fine. Yeah, it's first couple threads are gonna fight, so don't do what I just did. That was unwise. Yeah, I can see that the threads are a little bit unhappy, but we'll live. All right, plan B. We're gonna reef on this a little bit. Or you can try doing this, but you gotta be careful that you don't mushroom this. So you may wanna get a block of wood. Actually, that's a good idea. Because if this starts to mushroom out, then the nut won't fit back over it, and then you're in a jam. So, get you guys caught up. I did what I told you not to do, and I damaged the threads on this trying to get it out. I have a tap and die kit I'm going to try to fix that with, but again, don't damage these threads, because then you need a new control arm, which that can get really annoying to replace on this vehicle. This tie rod don't want to go. I don't know why, but she don't want to go. So I'm gonna see if I can do this without taking out the tie rod. Got the ABS off, I took the brake clip off. And then we're gonna go ahead and take care of this guy. I think it's like a 19. We'll get this bolt out. Once that's out, we shall see what that lets us do. Okay, updates. So this fella is a 16 on the bolt head, and it's an 18 on this side. I recommend you just take a wrench and hold here, and then take a power tool, 16, get this guy out. So if you're following along, where we are now is we have our sticky tie rod that doesn't want to go, which, by the way, these have a weird threading. These are M12s, but they have a 1.25 thread, which is super annoying because I don't have anything like that in my tap kit. So I'm probably going to destroy this nut getting this back on. I'll have one shot to do it, and that's about it. Anyway, so with the wishbone out of the way, that's cool. We need to take off the axle nut. Now the axle nut, I've got a 1 1/4, and that fits pretty well. I'm gonna guess that's like a 28 or a 29 in metric, something like that. It's a big boy. You're definitely gonna want a power tool to bust it loose. We gotta take that off because that's actually what holds the CV axle to the knuckle. So we gotta do that. I need to find a better place for the caliper, and then we're gonna need to bust loose the CV axle from the knuckle. It's gonna be kind of stuck. We're gonna have to unstick it. Once we do that, we gotta be able to slide the knuckle enough out of the way that we can actually pull the CV axle out. And that's partly why you wanna take this off. We may have to just try to swing it as far as we can to the right or towards the back of the vehicle, and hopefully that's enough. Okay. Oh, I just wanted this to be a simple job. But when your vehicle is approaching 300,000 miles, it's never simple. Come on, get in there. And boom. Power tools. Now, I've been talking whole video, don't smack things like this, but I'm totally okay with smacking this because I have a replacement part, and I'll show you the axle once I get it out, but it was time for it to come out because the boot is failing in multiple places. So, or boots, there's two. So it's time. But I'm gonna smack the ever-loving bejeebers out of this with my 4-pound hammer, and hopefully, particularly if I lube her down, it will come out of the hub, and we'll be good. I'm not gonna record that because this gets really loud, and you know, I don't want you to have to plug your ears. If you're gonna do that though, do watch your aim. You do not want to damage the hub. Don't do that. This is important for seating not only the rotor, but then the tire on top of that. So don't smack this. Don't go too crazy. All right. So I was able to get the tie rod out. This is a good thing. Or not tie rod, the CV axle. You'll notice it's peeing fluid. It pees a lot of fluid. I was being dumb, and this opens a hole in your transmission. So you want to have a catch pan ready. If you are not wanting to recycle the fluid, you need to be prepared to go buy multiple quarts of Mercon LV, which is what I'm gonna have to go get my hands on because that's a mixed oil catch. I just grabbed it as fast as I could because it's got a murder scene going on here, which is no bueno. Okay, so that's what's going on there. You need to look at this output seal really, really closely. Make sure, come on camera. Make sure that's in good shape. It's pliable, it's seated, and if it is, great. you don't need to do anything. But if it's damaged, if it moved, you're gonna need to replace it. And that's beyond the scope of what I'm doing. My seal is okay, but you can get these at your local auto parts store. I took a look before I started doing this just because. Anyway, let's go take a look at the axle and I'll show you what I was talking about with its. I'm not surprised that it's failing. All right, here's our axle. This end is the rotor end, the knuckle end. You can tell because this tone ring is here. You need that for the ABS. And if we look closely, you see these cracks. And you see these cracks. There's cracks in multiple places. This boot was failing. And I don't know, I'm seeing similar things over here. I'm not seeing an out and out hole, but it wouldn't have been much longer and this would have started getting holes in it, and then the grease that's supposed to be inside of here would have gotten slung out, and then that would have been it. After that, it locks up pretty quick, and you don't want one of these to lock up on you when you're going down the road at 60. Which is why when my wife finally told me about all this, I'm like, no, you can't drive your car. Not until I get this squared, because that's bad. Anyway. All right, so this end, the way that it stays retained inside the transmission is it's got this snap ring thing. And again, I'm in the South, so literally all I had to do was give it a good tug and it came out. If you're up north or if your car is just real rusty, you may need to get under there with a pry bar and work it, and that's why you got to be careful with the seal. But yeah, that's the CV. So I'm going to stop there on the CV part, and now we're going to switch our attentions to the shock part. I'll show you what I picked up for that. I didn't mention it, but I bought Motorcraft for these. CV axles to me are really important, and I want them to last 100,000 miles and I not have to worry about it. So I always buy Motorcraft when I buy CV axles. But I'll go ahead and get the parts over here, let you guys take a look, and then I'm probably stopping for lunch and gonna pick this back up, get to it. All right, as I mentioned, let's go ahead and show this to you. For our short guy, which is the driver's side, TX524 is the Motorcraft part. And for the passenger side, which is longer, it's actually gonna be a little bit more involved, TX571. And then I decided to try something new for shocks, because I've never done one of these shock strut things before. I figured I'd try it out. This is a Gabriel Ultra Ready mount G-Force, which is their Gabriel Ultra is their premium line. We'll see how it holds up. It's a G57427. I believe it's the same part number for both sides. Yeah, all right. Another thing that I just realized, because I'm a dingus, is if you're taking out the whole shock strut, right? You can make your life 1,000 times easier when you're taking the CV axle out. Just take the shock strut out. And then that gets the wishbone out of the way, right? And then it's super easy to slip out the CV axle. In fact, you won't need to worry about the tie rod at all, because you'll have all the clearance you need. You still need to disconnect your upper, because you need to be able to pull the knuckle forward and down so you can actually pop the axle out of the hub. But otherwise, yeah, that would make life a lot better. Take that out. Take it out from up here. You take these three out. And I think it should just drop down. It's been a hot minute since I've looked at the struts on this guy, but I believe that's what you do. You just take these 3 nuts off, and down it goes. All right, I'm back. We're gonna go ahead and we're gonna loosen these up here, see if we can't drop the whole shock tower down and get that out of the way. Looks like because this has been serviced before, a nut got lost along the way. So I think the original size is a 13 millimeter, but I have 2 13s and a 14 on my setup. Yep, came right off. It looks like it is dropping down. So take it off so you can see it. That in the middle is for when you are actually taking the shock out of the tower and you have to do your springs and your spring compressor and all that. That's where this one comes into play. But as far as holding the tower to the car, it's just these 3. All right, now that I have cleaned up most of the transmission fluid that I spilled, still gonna wind up with oil everywhere. Oh, duh. If you're taking the shock tower out, and I'm dingus because I mentioned this earlier, but you got to take the sway link off. So I'm gonna do that right quick. But once you do that, I mean, you take those 3 out at the top and then the whole thing comes out. It's kind of nice. As always, you want to lay out your parts and compare them. Yeah, I had it backwards. TX571, which is the longer of the 2 boxes, is actually the driver's side. It has a shaft at both ends, and they're about the same length. This one is a bit distended. It's kind of stretched out, which is why it looks a little bit longer. But if you were to compress the boot up like this one, it'd be the same length. So that's this one. And then the shorter box is what I assume is going to be the passenger axle, and there's going to be a shaft sticking out of the transmission, as long as that's the correct part. I hope it's the correct part, because the Famoco label here, the AE533A427-GA, does not match the Famoco label here. This is AE5Z3A42AC. So we're gonna see how that works. I'm gonna have to basically pull it and check. So one disadvantage from ordering from Rock Auto is sometimes they will straight up put the wrong part in the right box, or the wrong box with the right part. Sometimes you just don't know. But I'm pretty comfortable that this is the right part, so I will go ahead and proceed with the driver's side. Now what we're going to want to do is take some of that spilt transmission fluid, kind of rub that all up in here. There should already be plenty still oozing out, but kind of lube that up, and then we're going to reinsert it, and you're going to have to jiggle it a bit. See how it's splined? You'll have to jiggle it a bit until you get the splines lined in, and then this snap ring that acts as a retaining ring, right? It's going to fight you a bit, but once you give it a good shove and it's just right, it'll pop in, and you'll know it'll pop in because all of this is going to insert, and this cup is going to go made up with the seal that's sitting on the transmission. All right, take a look. You see that? You see that the shaft has slid in, so it's on the splines, but you'll see it's not fully seated. That's that retaining ring that's being sticky. So this is the part where you have to shove and kind of fight and curse and swear and snort. Kind of get it past that retaining ring, and then you get it flush to where that silver ring is sitting over the seal on the output of the transmission. All right guys, I got it seated, and this is how I did it. I had to lean on this really hard, but I managed to sneak the axle back into its slot here. And then I just grabbed on the upper control arm and pushed. And that gave me enough mass and enough leverage that I was able to get it past the retaining ring and just boop, and it went. And so then, you know, your last bit here is you gotta get this to spline up appropriately. And once you spline it up, it'll come all the way in. And at that point, you're good to go. You know, you gotta put everything else back together, but at least the CV is good. And once I get that to spline in, I'm gonna go ahead and switch gears back to the shock strut and figure out what to do there. So as I am fighting to get this side in, making sure your splines line up right, what I'm finding is rust has built up in these splines, and dirt, I guess. And so I've taken where'd I put it? Just a little wire brush, and I'm scrubbing out inside of here, and then I'm rinsing out what I loosen up with penetrating oil. I'm using the Good Stuff Croil, but PB Blaster, Knocker Loose, I mean, seriously, whatever you can get your hands on, local to you. Another good thing you can do at this point, if you're wondering about your wheel bearings, go ahead and turn them. This one's pretty quiet, so I'm pretty sure my roar noise is not bearings, at least not this one. So anyways, I'm gonna keep cleaning on this, and hopefully I can get it to where this thing will just slide right in, because right now I can't get it to come forward enough to where I can get some threading and where I could maybe use the threads to help me out and to pull this forward. I mean, I've got the other side seated, like I said, and that's good, but gotta take care of this. Well, that was entirely not fun, but I got it through enough to thread, and then I was able to use the nut to pull it the rest of the way in. I just had to get it super clean. All right, so you are supposed to torque this to something insane, like 180 foot-pounds, and you're also supposed to peen this in, knock this lip in into that groove, so that this can't come back out. Make sure you don't do that until you're 100% confident your build is good. And remember, you can do this just by taking the tire off, right? You can get the access you need. So, but don't forget, you are supposed to do that. Or put some thread locker on this, and that should do the same thing. All right, I'm gonna turn my attention finally to the shock tower and see what I need to do with that. All right, this turned out to be super simple. I just put it in my vise, and then took my hammer, beat on this little lip around this bolt hole here, and it slipped right off, no problem. So, looking at our new shock strut, we need to make sure that it has this little tab here, which it does. That tab lines up with here. And because this hasn't been sitting here for forever, we can take that, just slide it onto here. There's a 14mm bolt that I took out. That's the one that runs across here. That's your tightening bolt. We tighten her back up, and that's it. We just put in our new shock strut. They even included new hardware for the top. So, good stuff. I'm going to take care of that. I'm going to swing it back in on top of our CV axle, and then we can start putting everything back together. Okay, so my idea of dropping the shock in after you get the axle in, that works really well. You do need to put the shock's top on, and then the wishbone needs to stay off, so the shock's just sitting here. And then you gotta angle the wishbone in and then swing it around and then kind of wiggle it up into position like what you see here. Make sure that tab is fully seated and flush. Run your bolt through, and then you got it. So that's a much better way to handle the axle. And even if you're not taking your shocks out, I would do the same thing still. Just take this bolt out, beat right here to knock the wishbone loose before you try to pull the axle. Get the wishbone out of the way, and then you have much easier access to the axle, so that when you pop it out, it just you get it out of the way, right? It's not a giant mess like what you saw me do the first time. So learning from mistakes. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten this up. I need to get the caliper back on the other side here, make sure I have room to do it. And then in my case, because I have multiple blown, I have forgotten what these are called, boots. I've got multiple blown boots, so I'm gonna put grease in it just to kind of limp this along a little longer, but ultimately I'm gonna have to replace most of the suspension parts on this side. And that's because the previous owner, they bought a kit. They thought it was in good shape, a decent kit, but it turned out it was a not so decent kit and crap tore up. So onward. Okay, let's try this again with more storage on the phone. Okay, so I made some mistakes. Remember, I damaged those threads there. That wound up turning into a new tie rod, and that turned into a fight because that jam nut was way too tight. And that turned into a new upper control arm because I probably could have salvaged getting the nut back on, but the boot on this ball joint was completely blown out. Completely and utterly. So it was still worth it just to put a new control arm in. I could have tried to press out, press in ball joint. I do have the tool. I don't have the time. So I had to pay the parts store tax, and it was steep. Steep. This wasn't bad. It was like $35. Anyway, this now has a Zerk, a grease fitting like it's supposed to. It's got a castle nut like it's supposed to. This is good. Anyway, moral of that story, as I said, do not damage your threads. Whatever you do, however you try to get this stuff to separate, don't damage your threads. Okay, we've got the shock tower in, it's tight. I've got the wishbone in, it's tight. I've reconnected the sway link, it's tight. So all of that looks good. Our CV axle is in, which is good. I still need to torque this to 180 foot-pounds. What we're gonna basically wind up doing is something kind of like this, except for it's gonna be lower to the ground so that I can actually, get it on the ground. So I can get it that tight. That's the recommendation. If you can't jam it that way, basically you gotta jam it in some direction, right? So that you can get it that tight. I can't really think of any other way to do that. I don't have, that's my longest pry bar there, actually, unless I use a crowbar. Starting to put this back together. Remember, get the rotor back on. You got your two rotor retaining screws. They're Torx, they're T30. I just get them tight. Got to get this guy back in, and then we got to put the caliper back on. When you put the caliper back on, don't forget you've got a brake clip here. You've got it's kind of down here, you have an ABS sensor that goes in down here. I know you can't see real well, but don't forget those. Reload the caliper, get that back on, get it all put back together. And then at that point, except for this, you're done. And that is one side out of two. With that being said, this is the driver's side that we are working on. Passenger side, I will not film unless there is something that is different than on the driver's side, just for sake of time and keeping this video shorter. There should be a little bit of difference because the CV axle is different. If you look over there on the ground, you'll see that one doesn't have a shaft sticking out both sides. It only has it coming out one side. So we shall see. Anyway, I'm gonna wrap this up. I'm running out of daylight. I've been at this all day. Second side should go much faster if you follow that method I kind of figured out, where you take this out, take the sway link out, hammer this down, drop the tower, and then you'll have oodles of room for your CV axle, which will make taking it in, putting it out so much easier. And it'll make it so you do not need to actually remove your tie rod unless you want to. The only thing you'll need to remove, other than all this brake stuff, is you do have to separate the upper control arm. Good morning, everyone. Today is a new day. Wanted to point out, so I get some better light on it. See this shaft back here? And I can't see because my camera's being terrible. This is like an intermediate shaft, and all it is a shaft. It is a discrete part from your CV axle. You don't need to worry about it unless you see it leaking profusely or something. And then coming around over here is, if I can get my light to spin around, we get, I can't see, there we go. If you look there, that cup, that's the end of the actual CV axle. And I think the end of it is female, like the part that I grabbed yesterday. And we just need to get a pry bar up in there and pop that out. And then we should be good to go. And looking at this, all the oil congealed here. Probably got a leaky valve cover. Oh, we're just gonna deal with it. That's not today's job. Good afternoon, everyone. Today is a new day. It's been about a week since last we talked, and I had stopped here, not because I didn't have the parts for what I intended initially. I had stopped to figure out how to knock that out, and I know how to do that now. Basically just take a hammer and beat on it, pop it out. But I had stopped because of this. Remember when I said check your bearings, your wheel bearings? That's no good. Your bearing should not be that loud. So this one is either bad or it's going bad. Now, it wound up being cheaper for me to actually buy an entirely new knuckle versus just the bearing inside of it. Now notice when I spin this knuckle, you don't hear anything, right? That's what it should be. Or it should be very, very quiet. So that stopped me there, and I have not had time to work on it since. So next steps for me is I'm not going to worry quite about this CV axle yet, because we got to get the knuckle off. To do that, I'm going to put this back on to our upper control arm. And this ball joint is completely blown, by the way. See how easily that moves? That should be really stiff. And you can see it's not. So I also grabbed a new upper control arm because it was cheaper to do that than it was to actually get a new ball joint and press in a new ball joint. Go figure that out. Let's see. Yeah, the sway link's pretty shot too, but we're just gonna roll it for now. So anyway, I'm going to go ahead and get these lowers off, and I'm going to grab my air hammer to help loosen it up to get this off. And then we're also going to need to get this tie rod off, but I'll reconnect the top here of the knuckle to the upper control arm so that we can actually work on taking these lower parts off and then just spin this back off. Knuckle will be out of the way. I'll stick this caliper somewhere, maybe up in there or something like that. And then we'll start putting the new knuckle. Well, I'll finish getting the axle out at this point, but at that point, and then we'll get the new knuckle in. So anyway, that's what we're doing. Let's do it. Okay guys, I have updates, so you have to forgive me. I still have earplugs in. I've gotten the passenger axle out, and I can see why it was fighting me so hard. If you take a look, this is rusted. I'm gonna guess when the previous owner put this on, they didn't pack it with enough grease. So that grease got dried out, slung out, pick your word. And so this rusted, and it was kind of rust welded together. And the other thing that's important to see about this guy is if you look closely, and I'll see if I can get it in the light here. You see that bigger spline right there at the top, at the 12 o'clock position? This one has a keyway on it, so when you go to put the new axle on, you do need to line it up on that keyway. So just something to know. But that one failed on me when I went to take it off. So what I'm going to do here is, since that's a pretty tight seal into the carrier bearing, you know, I'm going to probably get some air or whatnot, get some PB Blaster, some Croil, kind of get all that crap out. Maybe scrub on it a bit with a wire brush, lube it up. And the new axle does come with some grease, but I might put some brake grease in there. That's a good all-purpose grease. And then I'll go ahead and shove the new one in position. This is kind of expanded, as you can see. I took a look. That's no good. So I'm going ahead and I'm replacing the lower control arms. And this ball joint was shot, so I'm replacing the upper control arm. It was cheaper to do that. Which means I got to go back to the other side and take these out. And they are a bear to take out without destroying them. This tool works well if it was a little bit bigger. If you could get a grinder in here and grind this out a little bit so it'll fit around this right here. This is like an M14 or something like that. And as such, it's really hard to get this out. Anyway, these ball joints are trash anyway. So I'll have those parts in tomorrow. So what I'm doing today is just getting everything prepped that I can get prepped. And then I will get everything back together once I have the parts. One other thing, I forgot I had these. These are CV axle pickle forks, basically. And I wound up using this one, and I used it to get under this metal cup. And that gave me enough pry leverage to pop it off. So that is a suggestion to get this off. If you go online and you look at popular videos on how to get this off, you'll see the person somehow squeezing a hammer, a big hammer back here, and knocking this off. Yeah, no, that's not happening. So I would invest in a set of these, or get the crow's foot style, so that essentially you can hook up a slide hammer to it and then just pop it out. But I don't have that. Oh boy, I should take a chance to empty that out, huh? So that doesn't wind up rotting out. Down here in the south, I get away with that. I'm sure our viewers up north aren't so lucky. All right, so we are on with the new one. And what I did to put it on, so I threaded this nut so it's just sticking out a little bit. Because really, the whole point of this is so that if it's rusty, you can take an air hammer with a point and you can shove it in. So I did that. I took my 3-pound hammer and I got it nice and tight. And then I just tapped like this. And eventually it seated and slid in. So we're in. I'm going to grab a bungee cord to kind of hang up. Probably hook it where the shock tower goes to hold this up. So this is not sitting at such a weird angle, unsupported for a long period of time. And then I'm going to move over to the other side. And like I said, I've expanded my work here and I will be doing the lower control arms. So I got to get those out on the other side. And the cool thing is you don't have to take your CV axle back out when you do that. You can just take these out. Now you do need to let the subframe down a little bit to get this out if you've never done this before. It's outside the scope of this video, but there are 2 nuts and 4 15mm bolts in the back. Take those out, the subframe will sag a little bit. You probably want to have a jack in place under the vehicle just to make sure it doesn't sag too much. But you let it sag a little bit and you'll get just enough clearance to get this bolt out. Just enough. You're gonna have to fight with it, but you'll be able to get it out. And once it's out, this comes out. And then, once I get my parts tomorrow, in theory, we just put everything back together and I am finally done with all this. This expanded a lot. Good evening, everyone. Today is kind of towards the end of a new day. Not really a ton to report that's directly related to this video, because the video was about, the shock towers and the CV axle, and I showed you how to do the shock towers and the CV axle. I can definitely confirm that it's easier to take the tower, get it installed first, and then just wiggle the wishbone up. As you can see, we're not done. There's a hole back there. The lower control arm that I needed did not show up today, but the other one did. So I went ahead and got it in, and I went ahead and rebuilt all of this because I'm just waiting on a control arm. And then this job is done and I can test. And if I didn't already say it, I'll say it again. If you have to mess with your tie rods at all, you really need to go get an alignment when you're done, because that's your steering. And if your tie rods are a little bit off, your steering is going to get weird. And there are torque values for these various fasteners. One that's kind of important, this guy here, I got my hand on, he runs through the lower control arm, and we got to preload him, just like you need to preload this guy, but you should not have had to take this guy off. But you did have to take this guy off. And so what you got to do is you're going to want to take a jack, and I can let this down now. I was retightening the subframe to the rest of the car. You have to loosen it in order to get the rear control arm, the rear lower control arm as they call it. But take a jack and get it underneath there. All right, start lifting it up. Really what you want to do is you want to take a measurement of where the wheel is sitting and everything before you lift it in the air. I talked about this already, but just kind of show you a quick and dirty way to give you preload. Get your jack to where you think the wheel's sitting about right if it was on the ground and everything. Then run your bolt through down there and then snug it tight. And what this does is, in the case of something that has a bushing or like a ball joint, what this will do is make it so that for the vast majority of your drive, the bushings, the rubber bushings, are not going to have to sit there and do a massive amount of moving to do their job, like if you tightened everything up and it wasn't sitting right. And ultimately what this turns into is it lasts longer. If there's a excessive amount of movement that the bushings have to do, then it wears at them much more quickly. They start to tear much more quickly. So for example, on the lower control arm on that end, that bushing will get loose and sloppy on you quick, and then it'll get loose and sloppy in other places. You'll start getting clunks and weird noises and things like that a lot sooner than if you preloaded it. So that's what preload means. That's what that term means. I know maybe 20 of you will actually listen to that explanation, but throwing it out there. So that's going to be it for today. Hopefully that control arm comes in tomorrow. And once we do that, we still got to torque this to 180 foot-pounds. And then get the wheels on, make sure the steering is relatively straight, I got to replace the transmission fluid that poured out when I took off the driver's side shaft, driver's side CV, and then we can test. Hello everyone. Today is the end of a new day. Finally got everything done. The forward, I was waiting on the forward lower control arm. That's in, everything's tightened up, and it looks good all the way through. Doesn't look like I mauled the tie rod whenever I straighten that back out. What I wanted to show you was make sure that you peen your axle nut, so knock it into that slot, and that's to make absolutely certain that it won't come undone on you. Previous owner didn't do this last time he did this, because you do have to straighten it out enough that you can spin this off when you have to do work on it. But better safe than sorry. I'm not the one driving this, it's my wife. So anyway, for the purposes of the video I was trying to show you, which was CV axles and struts, we're good, we're done. The other side wasn't terribly different other than what I showed you about the CV axle. And that thing that I said it went into that I didn't know the name of, that is the carrier bearing. I should have realized that, because this is basically just a drive shaft gone sideways. We are pretty much done. I need to put the tires back on, and then once it's out level-ish in the dirt, I need to let it warm up, because you're supposed to check the transmission fluid hot, and we know we spilled some, so we'll get it hot, we'll see where we are, top it off, and then we'll do a test drive. Okay, let's take a look at our transmission fluid levels, because I know when I pulled the driver's side, it leaked out quite a bit. And if you take a look, it is not on the stick, so we're pretty dry at the moment. I know we got it in there, I was able to back it up, so the pump's not destroying itself or anything right now, but we're low. So I like them. I bought some Valvoline, and this says it is recommended for Mercon LV, which is what we need for this transmission. If you take a close look, sometimes you'll see the Ford stamp, or you won't see it. If you see the stamp, it means they paid Ford for the licensing. If you don't see it, they probably formulated it to that standard, but they didn't want to pay the licensing. So, just letting you know, if you want to be 100% that this won't blow your crap up, get the Ford fluid, but Valvoline makes pretty good stuff. I trust them, so that's what's going in. Anyway, I'm gonna get that poured in. It's a pretty tiny hole that you gotta pour into. So I recommend a long neck funnel that's got a little tiny aperture, or something like that. But we're gonna get this topped off and then do the test drive. All right, folks, so symptoms were, we had probably wheel bearing noise at speed. We had a lot of excessive clunking when going over bumps. Oof, fluid level's still a little low in the transmission. But we're driving smooth. I didn't feel any clicking or popping when I released the brake. We are now approaching 60. And the excessive vibration noise that we were hearing that made me think something was going to fall off is gone. And my road is dirt, pretty bumpy, and instead of the usual clunk, 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 it's smooth, it's nice. So I just fixed a whole bunch of problems by rebuilding the front end. And she needs a little more fluid, probably, once I get it good and hot from this drive. That'll take care of that. But I'm gonna say that this, even though this one took a while, this has been an excellent success. I am very, very pleased. And I'll report anything else in, but otherwise this is going to be pretty much a wrap for the video.